Can you hear it? The signal is alive tonight, pulsing through the darkness, carrying two voices from the very shadows of horror. First, we'll descend into the fractured mind of a murderer in Edgar Allan Poe's timeless classic, The Telltale Heart. Join us as we explore a world where guilt whispers louder than reason, and the line between sanity and madness becomes terrifyingly thin. Then prepare to sail into the abyssal depths with H.P. Lovecraft's Dagon. We'll journey to a place where the sea hides secrets far older than mankind, and where a single glimpse of the unknown can shatter a soul forever. Steel your nerves and listen closely. The dead signal is broadcasting and you are tuned in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a transmission.
True. Nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been, and am. But why will you say that I am mad? A disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken, and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It's impossible to say how the idea first entered my brain, but once it was conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me an insult. For his gold, I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye, with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man, indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with a thick darkness, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily, steadily. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in the bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour, I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime, I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently, I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no! It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise. His fears had been growing on him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until, at length, a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot out and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And now have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but an over-acuteness of the senses? Now I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates a soldier into courage. But even yet, I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker, and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer, I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all, When I had made an end of these labors, It was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused, and they had been sent to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them, at length, to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles, in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by their observations, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God! No, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark! Louder! 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 Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug, which alone makes life endurable, I can bear this torture no longer. Tonight, I shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. But do not think me a weakling for my slavery to morphine. When you have heard my story, you may begin to guess, though never fully realize, why I must have either forgetfulness or death. It all began in the early days of the Great War. I was a supercargo on a packet ship in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific. Our vessel fell victim to a German sea raider. We were treated fairly as naval prisoners, so much so that 5 days after our capture, I managed to escape alone in a small boat, with enough water and provisions to last me for some time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had little idea of my surroundings. I'm no navigator, but I guessed I was somewhere south of the equator. For uncounted days, I drifted aimlessly beneath a scorching sun, waiting for a passing ship or the shore of some habitable land, but neither appeared. Despair began to set in, lost as I was in that heaving, unbroken vastness of blue. The change happened while I slept. I'll never know the details. My slumber was troubled and filled with dreams, but it was continuous. When I finally awoke, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire. It stretched in monotonous waves as far as I could see. My boat lay grounded some distance away. My first sensation wasn't wonder, but horror. There was a sinister quality in the air, and the rotting soil that chilled me to the very core. The entire region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and other, less describable things, protruding from the mud of the unending plain. I can't hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. The stillness itself, the sameness of the landscape, oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun blazed down from a sky that seemed almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as if reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled back into my stranded boat, I realized only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions that for millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. The new land was so vast, I couldn't hear even the faintest noise of the ocean, no matter how I strained my ears. That night, I slept little. The next day, I made a pack with food and water, preparing for a journey over land, in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, the soil was dry enough to walk upon. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I set out boldly for an unknown goal, forging steadily westward. My guide was a distant hummock that rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. By the fourth evening, I reached the base of the mound. It was much higher than it had appeared from a distance. Too weary to ascend, I slept in its shadow. I don't know why my dreams were so wild that night, but before the waning moon had risen far, I was awake in a cold sweat, determined to sleep no more. The visions I had experienced were too much to endure again. In the glow of the moon, I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the sun's glare, the journey would have been easier. I felt able to make the ascent that had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest. The monotony of the plain had been a source of vague horror, but my horror was greater when I gained the summit and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon. Its black recesses were still untouched by the moon's light. I felt I was on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. As the moon climbed higher, I began to see that the slopes of the valley weren't quite so steep. Ledges and outcroppings of rock offered easy footholds. Urged on by an impulse I cannot analyze, I scrambled down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope below, gazing into the Stygian depths where no light had yet penetrated. Suddenly, my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, about 100 yards ahead. It gleamed whitely in the new rays of the ascending moon. I soon assured myself it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that its shape and position were not entirely the work of nature. A closer look filled me with sensations I cannot express. Despite its enormous size and its location in an abyss that had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I saw beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith. Its massive bulk had known the workmanship, and perhaps the worship of living, thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near its zenith, revealed that a body of water flowed at the bottom of the chasm, winding out of sight. Across the chasm, wavelets washed the base of the Cyclopean monolith, and on its surface, I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, made up mostly of aquatic symbols: fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, whales. Several characters represented marine things unknown to the modern world, whose decomposing forms I had seen on the risen plain. But it was the carvings that held me spellbound. Plainly visible across the water were an array of bas-reliefs. I think they were supposed to depict men at least, a certain sort of men. But these creatures were shown disporting like fish in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at a monolithic shrine that appeared to be under the waves. Of their faces and forms, I dare not speak in detail. The mere memory makes me grow faint. They were grotesquely human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously, they were sculpted badly out of proportion with their background. One creature was shown killing a whale that was depicted as only a little larger than itself. I decided they must be the imaginary gods of some primitive seafaring tribe, whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck, I stood musing while the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith. It flung its gigantic, scaly arms around the stone, bowed its hideous head, and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. I remember little of my frantic ascent of the slope and my delirious journey back to the stranded boat. I believe I sang a great deal and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm. When I came to my senses, I was in a San Francisco hospital. I'd been picked up by an American ship. In my delirium, I had said much, but my words were given little attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing. Once, I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and asked him about the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god, but he was hopelessly conventional. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient relief and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all. Often I ask myself if it could not have all been a phantasm, a freak of fever, as I lay sun-stricken in the open boat. But an answer always comes, a hideously vivid vision. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may, at this very moment, be crawling on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny war-exhausted mankind. A day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand, the window. The window.
Have you ever felt it? That prickle on the back of your neck when you're alone in a silent house? Or the sudden chilling feeling that you're being watched from the shadows? These aren't just tricks of the mind. They're whispers from the other side, stories that refuse to die, echoing in the quietest moments of our lives. Today, we're tuning into one of those whispers, a tale that begins with a simple, abandoned farmhouse, but descends into a mystery that blurs the line between the living and what comes after. It's a story that will make you question every creak in the floorboards and every shadow in the corner of your eye. So, dim the lights, turn up the volume, and prepare to listen closely. The signal is coming through, and it has a story to tell. Are you ready to hear it?